Welcome back. So now that we've taken you through some of the history of the early Roman Empire, we're now going to return once again to our literature series and do some exploration of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Be aware, as you'll see in the video on this subject, that you have 3 special assignments to do pertaining to Ovid's Metamorphoses. You have 2 character presentations. There we are. 2 character presentations on a specific character taken from books 1 through 6 and then books 7 through 11. So those 2 on separate weeks. And then you have the point of view assignment for Ovid, imagining that Ovid is on trial. How would he defend himself? Or how would you, in a debate, advocate for the success of Ovid's Metamorphoses in praising Rome, or would you in fact speak against that point? So make sure that you do again watch the assignment videos that describe those, so you'll be able to complete those assignments properly. All right, so we're putting Metamorphoses now in the context of Ovid's response to the Roman Empire as an established form of government. You may remember that back before the midterm that when we were looking at Virgil's Aeneid, we were exploring that as the statement of the Roman Empire that's getting established and taking shape. Now we're talking about how is the Roman Empire actually going. So Ovid takes a much more sweeping view of the history of the Roman Empire than Virgil does, because somewhat similarly to the work of the Greek author Hesiod, who wrote a work called Theogony, or Creation, Ovid is going to initiate his work with creation. It is striking, if you have a chance to look at Hesiod's Theogony, you'll have a chance to make a comparison. But it's striking how somewhat biblical Ovid's version of creation is. Speaking, for instance, about God in the singular, almost like a monotheistic figure, and also talking about how there was this vast expanse within which earth, sea, and sky were eventually formed. So it's possible that there was some understanding of the Old or New Testament at that time, and possibly those kinds of stories were circulating and might have influenced Ovid's choice of story for the opening chapters of Metamorphoses. Now, Metamorphoses itself, as you probably understand, refers to transformations. And in most cases, with the stories of Metamorphoses as we understand them, the transformations involve actual physical transformation from one form to another. In many of those cases, the transformation occurs due to a punishment that is inflicted on a character who has committed some wrong. He may have been hubristic in some sense. He may have committed an ethical act, or possibly he angered one of the gods and thereby had to be punished for that reason. He may have been, or she may have been arrogant, challenging the god to something, or saying that the god was not as strong as she was, as in the case of both Arachne and Niobe. You'll see those characters in time. In some cases, the character in question committed some more human-like vice, and thereby had to be punished, as in the case of Lycaon, who tried to storm Mount Olympus, and so forth. So once again, as we did with Virgil's Aeneid, we're going to break up Ovid's very lengthy work, Metamorphoses, into 3 separate sections in order to understand the progression being made through Metamorphoses. There are the individual stories, of course, that are being described book by book, of the transformations that occur, but there's also a longer narrative, and these individual stories, some of which are packed into other stories, form part of this much longer narrative. We're actually going to return to that subject later when we have a video about the genres of satire and novel, especially novel, because based on an old form of literature called Milesian tales from Greece, we have a tradition of narratives that break into themselves to include other narratives, usually told by characters within the original narrative, that interrupt the plot, taking the reader off on a side track, and then eventually coming back to continue the original track. So Ovid's Metamorphoses does that to an extreme, because you have a sense of the history of Rome, but you have all these interspersions of one transformation story after another, sometimes again being narrated by characters within the larger narrative. So we'll talk in this video about the first books 1 through 6, what that talks about. Then in the next video, 7 through 11, and then finally 12 through 15 for the concluding video. So books 1 through 6, as we mentioned, discuss creation and relate a lot of the original stories about the Olympian gods, starting off with the character of Lycaon, the evil one who tries to challenge Mount Olympus and ultimately ends up turning into a wolf with undying hunger. We have the creation of the first race of humans, but it turns out to be unsatisfactory, and so we have a major flood that comes through, just like the biblical flood with Noah's Ark, and washes away humanity in order to basically push the reset button and start over again. Humanity survives despite the complete destruction of the flood because Deucalion and Pyrrha, an elderly couple, survive. They themselves are too old to bear children, so they approach the oracle of Dodona, and the oracle informs them that they need to leave with their heads veiled, and they need to throw in back of them as they leave the bones of their mother. They are quite horrified to hear this because they think that this is desecration, but eventually they realize that bones of their mother refers to the bones of Mother Earth, not their own biological mother, and that those bones are in fact stones. And so they throw pebbles in back of themselves as they leave. The pebbles that land in back of the man Deucalion turn into men. Those that land in back of Pyrrha, the wife, turn into women, and that is the repopulation of the earth at that point. So humanity therefore does continue, having survived the flood, but the original race of humans that were committing all sorts of evil deeds is successfully washed away. We get in these first books some examples of errors that happen, and the sense of error or mistake, which what the Greeks would call hamartia, which means trying to shoot at a mark and missing it, pervades the entire Metamorphoses. So what you should really think of with these most of these books, down to the story of Aeneas and the destruction of Troy and the foundation of Rome that we'll talk about in that video, what you should really think of is that we're going through a very gradual process of trying to come up with the correct setup for the world and for humanity to suit the Roman Empire, be able to run the Roman Empire correctly. So it's almost like having to go through a whole bunch of dress rehearsals, all sorts of things that go wrong. So if incest happens, that's bad, get rid of it. If somebody is arrogant to a god, bad, get rid of it. If some kind of immoral act is carried out, and somebody ends up dying, or there's some other accident that happens and somebody gets shot, for instance. We don't want those kinds of things to happen either, so that has to be eliminated. So gradually, what we have are these stories which really do two things. One is that they ideologically explain certain phenomena in the world around them. By ideologically, I'm referring to causation, trying to explain why certain things come about the way they do. So why, for instance, a leopard has spots? Well, obviously paint was dripped on him. Or why does a kangaroo have long legs that he uses for jumping? Well, because he was in a running race with a dingo, as it turns out. We're told by Rudyard Kipling in a famous work called The Sing-Song of Old Man Kangaroo. So causation means a specific set of incidents that result in a particular transformation or creation to occur that characterize the being in a specific way. So one of the most famous is the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, the story about how Pyramus and Thisbe meet out in a forest, but Thisbe gets there first. The two of them are going to elope from their families who are in conflict with each other. They don't get along. Thisbe arrives first, but she is chased away by a mountain lion, and she drops her veil. The mountain lion picks up the veil and chews on it, and the mountain lion happens to have a bloody mouth because she had caught some prey previously. So when she chews on this veil, she leaves bloodstains. Then Pyramus comes later after the lion has left the veil behind, and Pyramus thinks that Thisbe has been killed by an animal and commits suicide. And Thisbe, coming back, also finds Pyramus, and she commits suicide as well. The two of them had agreed to meet under a mulberry tree. All that blood from their bodies seeps into the mulberry tree, goes up into the roots and into the trunk, and finally gets into the berries themselves. They had been white berries, but then the blood of the mulberry, from the root of the mulberry tree turns those berries from white to red, and we have an explanation of why mulberry berries turn from white to red. That's an example of causation or etiology. So most of these stories do have some kind of etiological explanation behind them, but it's much more than that, clearly. There is also the moral ethos that governs this work, the sense of proper modes of behavior that need to be carried out. So Apollo, for instance, in the early chapters, commits the grave error of insulting his cousin Cupid, the son of Venus. And Cupid responds by shooting an arrow of love against Apollo, and then shooting an arrow of rejection against the completely innocent river nymph Daphne. Apollo ends up chasing after Daphne in lustful love for her, even being compared by Ovid to a hound that's chasing after a rabbit. The hound is coming along trying to catch the rabbit as its prey. And so Apollo ends up trying to catch Daphne. He thinks that he's being very kind to her by wanting to offer himself to her, but in fact she's terrified of him, as if he were a hound chasing after his prey. So it doesn't work. The result is that Daphne finally prays to the river god for salvation, and the river god, her father, turns her into a laurel tree. We have an explanation, therefore, of how Apollo ends up selecting the laurel tree as the symbol of victory in all of his music contests that he separately has established. But we also realize that Apollo's act of being arrogant toward his relative has a bad consequence, because it ruins the life of this particular, again, completely innocent young lady, as well as inflicting the pain of unrequited love back on Apollo. So let's hope that he learned a lesson from that. So it's these kinds of lessons that are taught through the process of these transformations that of course, are usually permanent, and thereby have a sense of damage associated with them, that there's some harm that's done as a result of someone's badly chosen or unjudgmental words or actions taken. So you have that story. You have the story of Narcissus and Echo. Echo blabbed on Juno about something, and so Juno forces Echo to say only the words that somebody has just spoken to her. And then later Narcissus comes. He falls in love with Echo. He does not fall in love with Echo, but she falls in love with him. And when she tries to communicate that to him, all she can do is just repeat his own words, and he finally rejects her. He's a very vain man who doesn't want to associate with any women. Echo ends up dying, and then a curse is put on Narcissus that he will live only so long as he never sees himself. And then Narcissus comes to a river and happens to see his reflection in the water, and he immediately falls in love with himself, and is finally transformed into the Narcissus flower. So once again, we have an etiological explanation of why this flower exists, the one that bends over and seems to be looking in the water. But we also have the ethical side of it, that once again we have a character flaw with Narcissus that has to be corrected, and essentially Narcissus ends up discovering that he cannot in fact reject love in his life the way that he had wanted to, and so he ends up dying relatively young in his life. So these are the early ethical principles that govern these particular works. So a lot of these involve direct interaction of some sort between gods and humans. So we have the gods created, we have humans first washed away and then recreated, and now we have the new human race. So many of the stories in the earlier parts of the work involve these often unsuccessful direct interactions between gods and heroes, or just ordinary humans. In many cases, it turns out badly, as in the case of Arachne and Athena, where Arachne challenges Athena to a weaving contest. And when it turns out that Arachne is actually quite good at weaving, Athena can't stand that, and so she whacks Arachne. And at that point, Arachne tries to commit suicide, and Athena then, seeing her hanging, transforms her into a monster that finally shrivels down and turns into the spider that obviously continues weaving and can hang from the ceiling. So again, an arrogant act by a human is appropriately punished by a deity, and we're all supposed to learn, simply don't do that with deities. They don't appreciate it. So you should therefore realize that the early books, refer to the way that humans are supposed to interact with the gods. Now, in our next video, we're going to turn to the middle section, and what we now get more into is how humans are supposed to relate to each other. If in fact humans get into some kind of tangled relationship that does not work out, or if the humans commit some kind of silly act, that in some cases the gods again will carry out some type of punishment, but in other cases the humans themselves will be stuck in a predicament that they cannot in fact get themselves out of. Okay, so we'll see you next video on the second of 3 videos on the middle section of Ovid's Metamorphoses.